Very few political entities could rival the Romans during their long existence. The Carthaginians, Parthians, and Nubians all come to mind, the latter of which I made a video series exploring. Another kingdom that comes to mind when thinking about Rome's foes is the Kingdom of Dacia. The Kingdom of Dacia was founded in the year 82 after a man named Burebista fought a series of wars to conquer and unite the Dacian tribes, and later crowned himself their king. Even before Burebista and his conquests, smaller kingdoms in the Carpathian Basin had arisen, giving the Romans problems with raiding for hundreds of years. We're not quite sure how large this kingdom was. We know for sure that the region surrounding the Carpathian Mountains, present-day Transylvania region of Romania, was the heartland and where the capital city Sarmizegetusa sat. Roman accounts from this time say that the kingdom extended into what was present-day Austria and Germany and Czechia. There is even an account from Julius Caesar saying that it extended up to the edge of the present-day Black Forest in Germany. All that being said, I would say that Dacia proper was in the Pannonian Plain, the Carpathian Basin, the Carpathian Mountains, and then the plains towards the Black Sea, and everything else was somewhat controlled. They may have conquered it, maybe under their control, but not really part of the state long term. So just think that the present-day borders of Romania was pretty much the heartland of the Dacian kingdom. The kingdom grew very wealthy due to gold mines that it controlled, and because of the trade routes. Dacia traded with the Romans, but also served as a middleman between the Germanic tribes and the Roman Empire, and also with the Illyrians. The Dacians were the descendants of Thracians that had moved northwards from Thrace in the Greek peninsula. Their heritage heavily influenced their culture, language, religion, and styles of warfare. Additionally, the Dacians took lots of influence from the Scythians, who neighbored them to the east. Eventually, the Dacians would even begin to incorporate some of the religious beliefs of the Scythians, in particular the belief in the Scythian deity Zalmoxis. And later on, Roman and Greek historians would talk about how the Dacians would even bring some of the Scythian ways of war, such as mounted horse archers, into their culture, although I'm not sure to what extent that really played later on in Dacia's history. Burebista ruled his kingdom for about 40 years until his death in 44 BC. While on paper the kingdom still somewhat existed, at least culturally, the reality is that 5 independent states had kind of formed in its remains. These 5 kingdoms all kind of interacted with each other and the Romans. In fact, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, betrothed his daughter to the Dacian king Cotizo in an attempt to form a political alliance of some sort. While the 5 kingdoms never posed a true threat to Rome on their own, Cotizo would raid across the Danube into Roman territory when the river would freeze. This status quo of a somewhat pacified region that was also kind of a vassal of Rome, but not really, stayed this way until he ruled the final Dacian king, Decebalus. Decebalus led a campaign against Domitian, and after achieving success, he was able to re-solidify their rule in the Carpathian Basin, and he once again began to consolidate power on the fringe of the Roman Empire, extending and consolidating territory on the Black Sea coast, a region in which Rome had been expanding its own influence. Recognizing the growing power of Decebalus, Emperor Trajan grew increasingly worried about the stability and safety of the wealthier provinces to the east. His worries proved to be true when the frequency of raids began to pick up, and reports of Decebalus receiving troops and envoys from Germanic tribes in the region arrived in Rome. Trajan decided to act and ordered the full-scale invasion of Dacia to end the threat once and for all. In the year 101 AD, the Roman Emperor Trajan faced an immense problem. To his east, a rising power threatened trade and influence in the Roman world and the empire's position in the Balkan Peninsula. The newly rebuilt Kingdom of Dacia, led by its king Decebalus, stood in opposition to complete Roman hegemony in the Balkans and posed an existential threat to the empire. Trajan was a military man, forged in the conquests of the early empire, and it would be under his reign and supervision that Rome's imperial territory would reach its absolute height. His strategic insights and administrative capabilities, in hindsight, were not wrong. He was right to fear the rising power of the Dacians and to fear the ambitions of their leader, Decebalus. Decebalus, like Trajan, was a military man. He had gained fame and power by reconstituting the power of the Dacian kingdom, and gained immense wealth by defeating the Roman army of Domitian, which was sent to attack his kingdom in the year 85 AD. The resulting treaty provided Decebalus with enough gold and material wealth that not only could refine his forces, but he was able to build great cities and even begin to model his army after the Romans. The Dacian army that Decebalus started with was not much different from the barbarian tribes the Romans were used to fighting, just with some extra horse attachments to augment their strength. With his new wealth, Decebalus began to create a bigger, better trained, and better equipped army. The rapid growth of the Dacian cities also helped with resource extraction. Dacia had large deposits of gold, iron, and other raw materials, making the kingdom very, very wealthy. When word reached Trajan that Decebalus could muster 250,000 soldiers, had created engines of war, and had gained access to technologies on par with the Romans, he realized that conflict was inevitable, and the longer he waited, the stronger Dacia would become. Understanding that his long-term goal would be against the Parthians, and that a potential alliance between the two powers could be a potent and potentially dangerous arrangement, Trajan made the call to invade Dacia. In the year 101, Trajan departed Italy with his army and invaded Dacia from the west. Trajan brought with him his best generals, including someone named Hadrian, which I don't know, may become important later on for the history of the Roman Empire, but who knows? His army advanced in 2 columns, each following their own rivers, the Danube and the Drobeta, respectively. They each followed their own lines of advance without receiving much, if any, pushback from the Dacians. This held true until the Third Battle of Tepe, which saw them defeating Decebalus' army, but not without sustaining major casualties. Trajan decided that he would create a series of forts here and would winter in the region, hoping to put pressure on Sarmizegetusa and force Decebalus into a peace deal. Decebalus had figured that this was Trajan's plan, and decided, in the winter, to attack south into the Roman province of Moesia Inferior. Decebalus moved his army and his allies, the Roxolani, across the Danube and into Roman territory. There, they were met with stiff resistance by the Roman general and governor Manius Maximus. Trajan had anticipated Decebalus' move and had placed a strong force under the capable governor's command. Decebalus and his armies were stopped, and his force was driven back into Dacian territory. The defeat in Moesia also saw the capture of Decebalus' sister, which obviously was terrible for morale of the Dacians. Trajan waited until March to launch another assault into the kingdom. His armies advanced in 3 columns, all with one goal: reach Sarmizegetusa. The columns all advanced at a methodical pace, and one by one, the famed citadels of Dacia fell to the Romans. Seeing the writing on the wall, Decebalus agreed to a peace settlement. The treaty was as follows. Dacia had to accept Roman garrisons across the kingdom, including a large one in the capital city of Sarmizegetusa. They had to return Roman deserters and turn over all of their war machines. They needed to cede some territory along the Danube, and they had to now give up their own foreign policy and instead submit themselves into Rome's orbit. Essentially, Dacia was now turned into a client kingdom of Rome. However, much to the surprise of the Dacians and to many of the Romans, Trajan began to send money and materials to Dacia to help Decebalus rebuild. His intention was for the kingdom to be a strong, allied buffer kingdom between Rome and the barbarian-inhabited lands to the north. While this was in theory a wonderful idea, the reality is that Decebalus just used all the material to enrich the kingdom once again and prepare for a rebellion against Roman rule. This rebellion occurred not long after, in the year 105, when all of a sudden, all Roman fortified positions across Dacia came under siege. Trajan was slow to respond to the rebellion, given that he had no reason to believe that one was even imminent. And while Trajan was trying to create a coherent plan for how to respond to the invasion, Decebalus attacked into Roman territory, though we know from accounts from the time that these did not go well. At the beginning of 106, Trajan, now having prepared himself, led a massive Roman invasion into Dacia. While Decebalus threw his armies at the Romans, inflicting heavy casualties, they continued their advance until they finally reached Sarmizegetusa and laid siege to the kingdom's capital. The siege was long and brutal, but eventually the kingdom's capital was indeed captured. The Dacians refused to surrender and instead continued to hold out in their large forts and citadels, and Decebalus fled north, attempting to preserve and reconstitute his war effort in the Carpathian Mountains. But he and his generals were caught by the Romans. He chose to take his own life rather than surrender, and his head was brought to Trajan. While the Roman armies continued to mop up resistance, the Second Dacian War was effectively over, and so was the kingdom. Rome annexed most of Dacia and let the rest fall away into the barbarian lands to the north. The parts of the kingdom that Rome annexed, in particular the old heartland of the kingdom, would go on to become the province of Dacia in the Roman Empire. Unlike most conflicts from that period of time, we actually have really good accounts of what happened in the Dacian Wars. In 113 AD, Trajan built what we call Trajan's Column as a way to commemorate and celebrate his victory over the Dacians. It still stands today in Rome, and it was because of all the details and the depictions and all the Latin script that was added to the column that we know so much about the campaigns. While the Kingdom of Dacia was now gone, banished into the history books, the new, complete Roman occupation of Dacia was just beginning. With the death of Decebalus, Trajan wasted no time in organizing his new conquests. The Kingdom of Dacia would split into two parts, a Roman and a barbarian state. Some territories to the northwest and across the Carpathian Mountains were left to the Free Dacians. The rest was organized into the Roman Empire. Dacia Superior and Dacia Inferior, and almost immediately, Roman colonists began to settle the region. New mines centered around the extraction of raw ore began to pop up, and trade, agriculture, and animal breeding also all took off. The Romans built Sarmizegetusa in their own image, and this new town, Olpia Traiania Sarmizegetusa, became the central hub for everything in the province and also one of the wealthiest cities in the empire. After the first wave of settlement, though, the Roman state hardly encouraged the settlement of people from other parts of the region. This had an interesting effect, where the local population completely outnumbered the Roman settlers, yet still began to fuse their cultures together. This fusion of culture and the survival of much of the indigenous beliefs is the beginnings of the modern-day Romanian people. While this only slightly affects the story here, I just thought I'd talk about it because it's a cool detail to mention, and I'm going to bring it up a little bit later. A keen eye can see and point out that Dacia extends outwards away from the Danube, which had become a natural border of the empire. This geographical position left the province open to frequent raids from the Free Dacians and also from other barbarian tribes on the periphery. This happened so often that the cost of garrisoning and protecting the province took a toll on the imperial treasury. Still, with the amount of money and commerce flowing through the region, it still made sense to hold on to it. Dacia was the site of multiple battles during the Marcomannic Wars, and like I mentioned before, the strategic vulnerabilities of the province were exacerbated further. As the empire began to fall apart in the crisis of the 3rd century, Dacia became a battlefield for the constant Roman civil wars and barbarian invasions. The constant warfare depopulated the province alongside Illyricum and Moesia. By 270, after Aurelian took power, it became apparent that Dacia was now way more trouble than it was worth. With the revolt of the Palmyran Empire, Aurelian needed to focus his efforts on stabilizing the Roman frontier and putting down the rebellion. In the year 271, Aurelian ordered the evacuation of Dacia. The Roman citizens who remained in the cities were resettled into the provinces of Moesia and Illyricum to replenish the population numbers there. While Aurelian did rename parts of Moesia as Dacia, the reality is that Roman Dacia had ceased to exist. In the following centuries, Dacia became home to many different barbarian tribes, the most important of which were the Goths. While the Roman Empire would still launch attacks and campaigns into the region, Roman authority never really returned to what it was before the abandonment. Any hope of the total reconquest died with the Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. The final thing we will talk about is what happened to the Daco-Romans. I previously mentioned how the fusion of Roman and native Dacian culture began to create the modern-day Romanian culture. While this is the leading theory for the formation of what would now become Romania and Moldova, there is another competing theory that I would like to at least talk about. Linguists have been able to pinpoint that the Romanian language began to form around the Danube River, particularly in what is then Moesia. Some scholars argue that the Daco-Romans left with the army, leaving behind not a Romanized region behind them, but an area inhabited by non-Latin speakers. It was the Daco-Romans who were resettled in Moesia and Illyricum that held on to their beliefs, and as the empire began to decline, the constant interactions with the barbarian tribes in the region, along with gradual migration flows, reintroduced the now Proto-Romanian language and culture back into the region. While I am more so a believer of the first theory, I'm not opposed to the latter, and I would not be surprised if this is in fact what actually happened. It just needs more research and evidence for that to be called. I hope you enjoyed this exploration into Dacia and its history with Rome. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe and follow me on social media, links in the description below. With that, having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video.